All right. Good evening. Hope you can hear me. You can probably hear the ocean behind me, or as people say here in Panama City, the Gulf, which has always kind of flipped me out because it is part of the ocean. But anyway, today we're going to talk about Chapter 11, Section 1. The Civil War begins. This comes from the textbook, The Americans. To begin with, there's no such thing as specifically a civil war. The fact that it's war means it's not going to be very civil. The idea of a civil war is two groups within a country both seeking control of that country. That definition doesn't completely or truly fit the United States Civil War. As a matter of fact, a lot of elderly people or people who grew up during your great grandparents' era or my grandparents' era actually were offended in the South when it was called a civil war. They preferred the term the war between the states because you actually had two designated groups, the United States and then the breakaway portion called the Confederate States, who were fighting each other. Now, but it is officially known as the Civil War, and that's the term that we'll use. Once Abraham Lincoln was elected president, people were terrified that he would be assassinated before he ever took office. As a matter of fact, he had to go in disguise um, through Maryland. He had to bypass Baltimore altogether and went straight to D.C. If you remember, it was Lincoln's election that the southern states actually decided to quit, not to quit, but to secede from the country. Once Lincoln was elected and before he was inaugurated, most of the northern troops, most of the U.S. federal troops, withdrew from forts within the South. However, there was a fort in Florida and the most famous fort in South Carolina known as Fort Sumter, where Union forces held those forts. And Fort Sumter remained in Union control. The Confederates demanded control of the fort or threatened to attack. The fort supplies and the food and supplies would last only 6 weeks. Lincoln had a dilemma here. Should he reinforce Fort Sumter, which would be an act of war, and may encourage Virginia to secede and Britain to help the South, or should he evacuate the fort, which would show his weakness and anger his fellow Republicans and endanger the Union? There's a brief video here, and you can watch it called The Fall of Fort Sumter. We're not going to watch it during this particular show. It'd be a video. However, it's very good. And when you follow the online lecture, the non-video portion that on my website, coachvice.com, you can actually find that particular video. The first shots of the Civil War were actually fired when the South um, fired on Fort Sumter. There is debate, but most people believe that Jefferson Davis authorized the South Carolinian government to fire on Fort Sumter. Other people said that it was strictly a South Carolinian decision, but nonetheless, the fort would fall. And once this happened, Lincoln called on all the states in the Union to supply recruits. Where Virginia and the other border states, for the most part, said, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to fight against the South. And they seceded shortly after the firing on Fort Sumter. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina all secede. However, technically, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri remain neutral, but that was not actually the case. Maryland, for instance, was under Union control, martial law. Delaware had a very lackluster support of the Confederacy. Most of those people were Union people. Kentucky, Lincoln did try to leave Kentucky neutral, at least temporarily, but nonetheless, it would soon fall firmly into Union hands. Missouri, on the other hand, actually developed two state governments, a Confederate government and a Union government, even though the Confederate government never had any real power. Most people expected a very short war. The Union had the largest number of soldiers, had plenty of industry, food, and railroads. The Confederates, on the other hand, had huge profits from their cotton, had by far the best officers, and a motivation. They were defending their home court or their home country. Now, I've told you over and over again how slavery is the root cause of the war, and we don't need to lose sight of that. However, the majority of people who were fighting this particular war did not own slaves. And though slavery was the cause, for the average soldier, they were fighting for their homeland, having nothing to do with slavery. So we have to be able to distinguish those two. The Union developed a plan developed by General Winfield Scott, the hero of the Mexican War, called the Anaconda Plan. And it was a three-pronged Union strategy to win the war. The first part was to use the Union Navy to blockade southern ports, and then use the Mississippi River to divide the Confederacy in two parts, and to capture Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital, which was, not very far from Washington, D.C. The Confederate strategy, on the other hand, was play defense, invade the North if the opportunity arises. The first large-scale battle was called the Battle of Manassas Creek in the south and the Battle of Bull Run in the north. It was very near Washington, D.C. Most people in the North thought that the Union Army would devastate the Confederates, and actually, a lot of the civilians in Washington, D.C. came out on the surrounding hills to watch this battle. Once the Confederate Army held and reinforcements arrived, largely due to the holding of General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, it was a rout. The Confederate forces forced the Union Army all the way back into D.C. And there are many historians who believe that if the South or if the Confederate forces had continued on into D.C., the war would have ended right there. However, Jefferson Davis did not want to provoke a full-scale war, and therefore he ordered the troops to stop. Here's a good picture of General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, the idea of splitting the Confederacy down the middle through the Mississippi River and blockading it using the ships. Okay. He actually proposed this to President Buchanan. Here's a picture of Stonewall Jackson after the Battle of Bull Run. There is a huge era in this painting, however. If you look at the battle flags flown in the background, those flags weren't actually put into place until 1862. And the South had another flag, which looked very similar to the U.S. flag before then. After Bull Run, President Lincoln called for 1 million additional soldiers, and he appointed General George McClellan to lead the Army of the Potomac, and he instituted the nation's first income tax. General Ulysses S. Grant, brave and tough, decisive commander in the West, captured Confederate Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee. And by the end of 1862, most of the state of Tennessee had fallen into Union hands. Not all of it, but the majority of it. There were parts around Chattanooga which were Confederate and some other areas. The Confederates surprised Union soldiers at Shiloh Church in Tennessee, leaving 24,000 dead after the Confederates retreated. This will be a long, bloody war, and the rebels or the Confederates are very vulnerable in the West. Here's some brief information about Ulysses S. Grant. He was originally known as Hiram Grant, or Hiram Ulysses Grant, but they got his name wrong at West Point. So instead of going through all the bureaucracy to change his name, he basically just changed it himself. He had served in the Mexican War with distinction. He didn't have great grades at West Point. He had suffered with bouts of alcoholism, tried to be a farmer and a storekeeper before the war called him back. The Civil War would see an increase in technological advances as well. The South built a ship called the Merrimac, which was officially renamed the Virginia, and it was a metal ship called an ironclad, and it sank a lot of the wooden ships in and around Norfolk, Virginia. However, the North sent their own Merrimac, the Monitor, and they fought, and this became the first true battle between two iron ships. You also had a situation where the South would build a submarine, which would become the first submarine to sink a ship in battle. The war for the capitals. Lincoln in the North publicly mocked General McClellan's extreme cautiousness and reluctance to fight. On the way to Richmond, McClellan encounters General Robert E. Lee's forces. He retreats after losing the 7 Days Battle to Lee, and this is called the Peninsular Campaign. Lee moved toward Washington, D.C., and faced McClellan in the town of Antietam, Maryland. And this was the bloodiest battle in American history, or at least the bloodiest one-day battle. 26,000 dead, more than the War of 1812 and the Mexican War combined, all in one day. The Confederates lost one-fourth of their army in this battle. Technically, it was a draw. Some people call it a Confederate victory. But nonetheless, the damaged Confederate army that could have ended the war if McClellan had pursued them. Lincoln fired McClellan after failing to pursue the Confederates after the loss at Antietam. And that concludes Section 1, the Civil War.